You are standing beside a small fire 14,400 years ago. The wind moves through dry grass. Dark stones cover the ground. A few shelters stand nearby. There are no farms, no bakeries, no flour mills, no shelves stacked with bread. If you are hungry, you cannot simply buy food. You must search for it, hunt it, gather it, carry it, prepare it, and hope tomorrow brings more. Around you, people collect tiny seeds from wild grasses. They look almost useless, too small to fill a hand, too hard to chew, too slow to gather. But inside those seeds is a discovery that will one day help feed cities, armies, families, and entire civilizations. So how did ancient humans invent bread? Long before bread, humans already knew fire. They knew how to roast meat, cook roots, dry plants, and make food easier to eat. But wild grain was different. It was not a large animal that could feed many people at once. It was not fruit that could be picked from a branch. It was 1,000 tiny pieces of food scattered across the landscape. To collect enough grain, people needed patience. They had to find the right grasses at the right time of year. They had to pull, cut, or shake the seeds loose. They had to keep them dry. They had to remove dirt, husks, and stones. And after all that work, the seeds were still hard. A mouthful of raw grain was not a meal. It needed to be changed. At first, people may have eaten seeds whole. They may have roasted them over fire. They may have crushed them into rough pieces. But somewhere, in many small experiments across many generations, people learned something important. A hard seed could become soft. A dry seed could become dough. And dough could become food. Before bread, human groups lived by movement. They followed seasons. They followed animals. They knew where fruit ripened, where fish gathered, where water stayed when the land became dry. Their lives were built on memory, not written memory, living memory. The memory of parents, grandparents, neighbors, people who knew which plants healed, which berries harmed, which roots could be cooked, and which fields of wild grass could feed a group when other food was scarce. For a long time, this worked. Small groups could move when food disappeared. They could avoid drought. They could follow herds. They could adapt. But wild food was never fully predictable. A storm could ruin a season. Animals could move away. A dry year could shrink the harvest of nuts, fruits, and grass seeds. And feeding more people became harder. But then something changed. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But in some places, humans began paying closer attention to wild plants. They noticed where certain grasses grew. They returned to the same areas. They carried seeds. They used stone tools to pound and grind. They learned that the land was not only something to travel through, it was something that could be studied, worked, and eventually changed. First, humans gathered wild grain. Then they crushed it between stones. And then they mixed the crushed grain with water. Imagine the sound. Stone against stone. A heavy grinding slab on the ground. A smaller handheld stone moving back and forth. Seeds breaking apart. Husks cracking. Dust rising. Hands becoming tired. This was not easy work. Making flour by hand took time. It took strength and it took skill. Grind too little and the food stayed rough. Grind too much carelessly and grit from the stone could mix into the meal. Add too much water and the mixture became thin and messy. Add too little, and it fell apart. But humans kept trying, because the reward was powerful. A handful of seeds could become a shared meal. The problem was simple. Wild grains were hard. The first attempt was crushing them, but crushed grain was still dry and difficult to eat. Then came the discovery. Water could bind the flour, heat could transform it. A rough dough could be pressed flat, placed onto a hot stone, covered in ash, set near glowing embers, or cooked beside a fire. And suddenly, the food changed. It became warmer, softer, easier to chew, easier to carry, and easier to divide among people. That was the first bread. Not a tall loaf, not a fluffy sandwich slice, not a golden crust from a modern oven. It was probably a dense, flat, rough cake, dark from smoke, filled with bits of husk, made from whatever wild plants the people could gather. But it was still an extraordinary achievement. Humans had taken wild grass, broken it apart, mixed it with water, and used fire to create a new food. Bread was born from observation, from trial and error, from hands that refused to accept that a seed had only one use. And the discovery changed how people saw grain. Wild cereals were no longer just small seeds to chew or roast. They were ingredients. They could become flour. Flour could become dough, and dough could become something greater than the seed itself. But there was a limitation. Making bread from wild grain was difficult. The grain had to be found in the landscape. It had to be gathered one small handful at a time. And it was only available in large amounts during certain seasons. A community could make bread, but it could not always make enough. Not unless it found a way to control the supply. That question would help shape the next great change in human history. Farming. People did not invent farming in a single year. They did not wake up one morning and decide to become farmers. For generations, communities gathered wild plants and returned to familiar places. They began living longer near reliable water. They collected seeds from the plants they valued most. They may have encouraged useful plants to grow near their settlements. Slowly, people began planting, protecting, harvesting, and saving seeds for the next season. The plants changed, and so did human life. Wild grasses became cultivated cereals. Fields began to replace some of the old wandering patterns. Harvests became larger, grain became easier to store, and bread became easier to make more often. This was the breakthrough. Bread no longer depended only on what the wild landscape offered. Now people could grow grain near home. A field could produce food for months. A storehouse could hold grain through winter. A family could grind flour when it needed it, and a village could feed more people than before. But this new life came with a price. A farmer could not simply leave when the land became difficult. Fields had to be watched, seeds had to be saved, crops had to be protected from animals, storms, pests, and thieves. A failed harvest could bring hunger. A flood could destroy months of labor. A drought could empty a village's storage jars. Bread offered security, but it also tied people more tightly to land. The system grew. Grain needed fields. Fields needed labor. Labor needed tools. Tools needed skilled makers. Harvests needed storage. Storage needed protection. And protection needed rules. Villages became larger. Some became towns. Some became cities. In these growing societies, grain was not only food, it was wealth. It could feed workers, support rulers, pay laborers, supply soldiers, and keep a city alive during difficult seasons. Bread became part of everyday survival. In ancient Egypt, the rhythm of life followed the Nile. When floodwaters retreated, fertile mud remained. Farmers planted grain. Months later, they harvested it. Workers carried sheaves. Others separated grain from stalks. Others ground flour. Others mixed dough. Others baked loaves. Bread appeared in homes, workshops, temples, tombs, and storerooms. It was eaten by ordinary families. It was given as rations. It was used in offerings. It was part of what people believed they would need even after death. In Mesopotamia, grain also became deeply connected to city life. Barley fields helped feed growing populations. Clay tablets recorded rations. Officials counted supplies. Workers depended on grain distributions. The tiny seed had become part of a huge machine. A field outside the city could help support builders inside it. And builders could raise walls, temples, canals, and homes. Bread helped make settled life possible. But every solution creates another problem. When grain became valuable, people fought over it. Land became valuable. Water became valuable. Storage became valuable. Those who controlled fields and granaries could gain power over those who did not. Some people owned more land. Some had more grain. Some worked hard, but depended on rations. The same bread that helped communities survive could also reveal inequality. A full granary could mean safety, but it could also mean control. A ruler who controlled food could reward loyalty, punish enemies, feed soldiers, or demand labor. Bread was never just food. It was survival. But it was also power. And still, humans kept improving it. They discovered new grains, new methods of grinding, new ways to shape dough, new ovens, new flavors. Some breads stayed flat, some became thicker, some were fermented, some were steamed, some were cooked on clay, stone, metal, or inside deep ovens. Every region developed its own answer. In dry lands, thin flatbreads could cook quickly. In colder places, dense grain loaves could last longer. In river valleys, abundant harvests created more varieties. In mountain regions, people used the grains that could survive at high altitude. There was never one bread. There were countless breads, each one shaped by climate, by crops, by tools, by fire, by memory, and by the hands that made it. Today, bread can seem ordinary. A loaf in a plastic bag, toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, flatbread beside dinner, a roll placed on a restaurant table, but behind every piece of bread is a very old human story. Tonight, you will break bread. You may not think about it, but it exists because ancient people noticed that wild grass seeds could become more than seeds. First, humans gathered grain from the land. Then they crushed it into flour. Then they added water. Then they placed dough beside fire. Then they learned to grow more grain than the wild world could easily provide. And eventually, bread helped feed villages, cities, workers, travelers, families, and civilizations. Bread is more than flour and water. It is the memory of ancient hands, hands that gathered, hands that ground, hands that shaped dough beside a fire, and hands that discovered one of humanity's oldest and most powerful foods.